Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to welcome you on behalf of ESB to the third lecture in the 2014 ESB Power to the People lecture series. As Tom says, we have a long and proud relationship with the institution. And this series of lectures provides a very important forum for generating debate and advancing thinking on the complex challenges facing the energy sector today and how we can work together. And I believe it's really, really important that we do work together on resolving them. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to address you today. I'm pleased also to have Eamon Ryan here, former Minister, because Eamon and I, we challenge each other on these kind of issues and the issues I'm going to raise. And the one thing I'd be really interested in here is having a good old debate about it, so I might have less to say rather than more in the interest of maybe promoting a bit of a debate. I happen to have the privilege of being Chief Executive of ESB. I've spent 30 plus years in ESB, and I'm very proud of the company. I'm very proud of its heritage and its contribution to the development of the energy system and our Irish society and the economy in Ireland. ESB is 10 billion plus assets in public ownership. We have undergone a huge transformation from being an incumbent monopoly generator, transmitter, distributor of electricity for, I suppose, over 60 years to, with increasing competition and regulation, now to a point where we are a player, one of many players in the Irish and indeed the European energy sector. What I'd just like to talk about today is just maybe some challenges for European energy policy and how they are the same challenges, similar challenges for Irish energy policy. And it's particularly relevant given that we have, I see Ken Spratt here, Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy, Communication and Natural Resources, given that that department has just issued and the Minister has just launched a consultation, a green paper on energy and energy policy. But the context of all of this, I suppose, is the EU ambition for a single European market, and I'd like to come back to that point maybe during, over the course of what I'm going to say. Of course, everybody knows that electricity is an essential service. People expect it when they turn on the light switch on the wall, the lights just come on. It is a long cycle. It's characterised by being a long life, capital intensive business, and that's really, really important. You invest today. People who invest in the energy and electricity sector today invest billions to get a return on that investment over anything from 20 to 40 years. And, what I'm going to, really the question I'm going to pose here is really how do you achieve that kind of investment? And there's a huge investment needed in this industry. How do you achieve that investment in the context of markets and the role that markets and regulation will play in doing that? Electricity, of course, is a huge enabler of societal well-being and, of course, of the economy, and it is an essential service. But the future we're facing in the energy sector is more complex and uncertain than it ever has been. The way electricity is produced, transported and consumed is changing quite dramatically, and it's driven predominantly by technology, market regulation policies, and, of course, in the last 10 or so years, the need to decarbonise our electricity system to address the global challenge of climate change. Traditionally, and for many, many years, the electricity industry is over 100 years old, but for most of that, it's been characterised by very large-scale, centralised generation plant feeding into a transmission system, and then a radial, what we call a radial distribution network, bringing electricity to customers. And those long-term decisions that were necessary about capital-intensive projects could be made in an environment of relative certainty in terms of the return on that investment. And that was kind of up to maybe 20, 25 years ago. That was how the electricity industry was characterised. But from about 1990 onwards, and driven mainly by the UK, European energy policy focused exclusively on costs and lower prices. So it was an efficiency driver from about 1990 onwards. And the UK, as I said, led this way by adopting a market-based approach to managing generation and introducing an independent regulator into that piece of the value chain. It is accepted that the networks piece of the value chain is a natural monopoly. So on the back of UK policy, competition in generation, competition in retailer supply, and regulation of the wires component of it. And the rest of Europe followed. And I think the UK today is really interesting. From having started the cycle 25 years ago, what's happening today in Great Britain, the UK government is actually on the cusp of driving some very, very significant thinking around the evolution of markets and regulation in the last 25 years on the back of unique problems that exist in the UK in terms of affordability, in terms of decarbonisation, and in terms of security of supply, the trilemma that Tom spoke about. And this system that has been in place since the 1990s worked well. On the network side, the regulatory model provided certainty for the necessary investment in network assets, and it provided an environment where network asset owners were achieving adequate returns. And the emergence then of combined cycle gas generation technology, particularly CCGT technology, is relatively fast build, relatively fast payback. And that's an important concept in terms of markets. Then it kind of standardised the new generation fleet right across Europe, and it effectively made electricity a commodity at the wholesale level, which is one of the desires or the ambitions of the creators of energy markets. But around 2005, the dynamic was changing, but in 2005 was a critical changing point, I believe. The well-recognised dilemma of cost and security of supply took on a third component, which was the climate change component, and that was kind of evidenced by the 2020, the EU third energy package, what's called the 2020 package, which made sustainability a key part of energy policy. It added that third leg to security of supply and cost. And EU leaders signed up to binding commitments to achieve a 20% reduction in greenhouse gases from 1990 levels, to raise the share of energy consumption from renewables to 20% and to deliver a 20% improvement in energy efficiency. And it is clear that there have been some conflicting elements to those policies. Like a key driver of the generation piece of that was the creation of a carbon market, but the carbon market has failed. And the way in which the carbon market collides with renewable targets, and renewable targets were allowed to be set at national level, so individual countries across Europe could set their own renewables targets, and that had an impact on how that collided with the carbon market. And the effect now that there's a new package has come from the energy, 2030 package has come from the EU Commission, which looks at a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases right across Europe on a pan-European basis, and renewables targets of 27% set on a pan-European basis, but not clear what the in-country component of that is going to be. And that piece of how that policy is implemented will be a key driver of the energy system and investments in the energy system in the period beyond 2020. And what we need is certainty in that particular regard, but we need certainty beyond 2020. If the desire of Europe is to decarbonise the electricity industry or an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, we need certainty, investment certainty beyond that 2030 horizon. And it's back to that long cycle capital investment kind of characteristic of the electricity system that I mentioned. We will invest in technologies today, and are investing, as all developers and all generators are, in technology today that will be around in 2050 or 2060. So we need certainty to actually backstop that in investment. But, again, the electricity system right across Europe, and Ireland was no different in this regard, was identified as a primary vehicle to achieve these 2020 targets. And that, on the basis that if you decarbonise electricity, you can actually decarbonise the economy. And it completely changed the dynamic of the industry. So, and where we're heading now is away from that large-scale centralised generation system to a very, very different type. So instead of that centralised generation feeding to broadly passive consumers, we are heading now for a combination of large-scale centralised generation and distributed generation and distributed storage. But we talk of customers now instead of consumers, and customers in the future will be producers. So we will have people right out at the end of the electricity system who will be producing their own electricity, but also buying electricity. And this presents a huge challenge for a wholly market-based system. Markets work best when their only job is to match up supply and demand for commoditized products at the appropriate cost. Markets are not so good when they're required to deliver a wide range of outcomes now required by policymakers in a political system which changes every 5 years. So again, a long cycle, capital intensive industry that has a 20 to 40 year investment cycle, but a policy system, a political system where EU commissions and governments change on a 5 year basis is a key consideration in terms of future energy policy. The regulatory models for networks by and large have remained unchanged despite there's been massive investment in networks and to support a different kind of mix of generation, particularly in terms of renewables and in terms of the huge data now that is now needed that be generated by millions of customers who are going to, using smart technologies in the future, will be interacting proactively with the electricity system. Now, from a policy perspective, I believe then there are kind of, I suppose there's many considerations, but it comes back to, I believe, three fundamental questions. Is the current regulatory model fit for purpose to deliver the scale of investment needed in networks? And is the market the best means of organising the generation sector? And the third piece then is, will the penetration of technology at the customer end fundamentally change the electricity value chain? Now, looking first at the regulatory framework, it's hard to see an alternative to the current model whereby an independent third-party regulator regulates costs and outputs for network operators. We have 5 year price control periods here, similar to most other regulated network asset owners. The regulator determines capital required to invest in the network and benchmarks and determines operating costs. And this effectively ensures that customers pay an efficient cost for their network services. And the model has worked well here. It has given reasonable stability in terms of network investment, and ESB has invested about 7 billion in the electricity network over the past decade, to a point where Ireland has one of the most advanced electricity networks in Europe and probably indeed in the world. But the task of regulators is becoming much more complex as networks develop to meet the changing needs of the sector, particularly in terms of the huge investments needed to support an energy system of the future characterised by different forms of generation, renewable generation, particularly intermittent generation and new smart technologies, and more customer choice, particularly as customers now become both consumers and generators of electricity. So the networks of the future will face very different challenges, and they will have to develop a whole range of services that heretofore they didn't have to develop, and this has implications for costs. And if you look at maybe a couple of scenarios that might materialise, traditional networks have been monopoly services, but networks will compete in the future with alternative energy sources. For example, rooftop solar technologies is a local distributed generation source, and so what we see, and we see this happening in the likes of Germany, where distributed generation at the level of the household through solar technologies subvented by attractive government subventions then means that investment in conventional generation is being stranded, and that's required to support or to back up when, for example, the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. And what that means also for the networks business is that the effectively bypasses the networks business then, or the networks become more a backup service to customers who have their own generation, effectively bypassing, if you like, the networks. So what does that mean for society? Because the networks model, charging model, is a socialised charging model, so that if I have solar on my roof and somebody doesn't, then the charge I pay for an intermittent service provided by that network is effectively cross-subsidised by the customer who doesn't have solar. Has all kinds of issues in terms of affordability and in terms of fuel poverty. And we see this now happening across the world, where solar technologies, particularly solar technologies, are distributed, household distributed generation technologies are being deployed. If we look at the market, and I suppose the key question here is, can a market actually deliver the clean generation technologies needed for the future? And I suppose it depends on what you're trying to achieve in terms of outcomes. Market has delivered. It has delivered competitive outcomes and significant benefits for customers by driving efficiencies right across Europe. But efficiencies now are only one part of the picture. And the predominant trend in the last 5 or 6 years has been the return of state intervention. So as more and more new technologies, particularly technologies to drive decarbonisation, come onto the power system, then the role of markets and traditional generation technologies and how they interact with renewable technologies which are supported by government funding, then it creates unintended consequences in terms of how can owners and investors in standby or backup technology or traditional technologies kind of compete with, through a market, with technologies that are effectively out of market in traditional cost terms but are needed to actually provide clean technologies. So how can traditional technologies in generation compete with supported technologies? And again, as I said, I gave the German example. We also see the example in Spain of what's called a tariff deficit, where the Spanish government drove huge penetration in renewables to a point where there was oversupply of renewables, and existing fossil fuel plants which were required for standby were no longer economically viable. The Spanish government pulled back on its renewable subsidies to a point where there's a huge deficit now that the Spanish government is kind of holding on to, because to actually pass that deficit back on to customers would actually raise prices. So markets are good, but they can't deliver everything. And if we want to decarbonise the economy by 2050, we have to decarbonise the generation sector. But I don't believe there's any silver bullet to this. There's no single technology that is going to actually deliver a decarbonised electricity system by 2050. The answer is always going to be a mix. The answer is going to be a mix of nuclear, of clean fossil fuel generation technologies. I believe that fossil fuel generation technologies have a role to play in the future. They will become increasingly cleaner. And of course, new technologies in terms of renewables, in terms of solar, in terms of wind, and fuel cells, distributed storage. So there's a whole plethora and a whole host of technologies that are going to be required to deliver the electricity system of the future. And how is the market going to do this is a key question. While governments have to intervene to decarbonisation and climate change is a policy issue, so markets will not solve the decarbonisation issue. So how are governments going to intervene in such a way that it makes it feasible for investors in traditional technologies and technologies that are at market to coexist alongside technologies that are immature and not yet at market? And of course, the issue then about subsidies looms large in all of this. How can subsidies do distort markets? And if the role of subsidies is to incubate new investments, then at what point do subsidies fall away? We've an issue now today. Onshore wind today is probably competitive with traditional generation technologies, but is still being subsidised. So subsidies should be seen as a way of incubating new technologies, but should be time bound. Now, the third point I want to cover was the whole penetration of technology at the customer end, and the connected customer will play a huge role in decarbonisation. And this is all about the efficiency and the usage of end-use energy. And it's interesting to look at what is happening. Like Google and Microsoft some years ago entered into the home energy monitoring market, but quickly exited. And Google recently have bought Nest Labs for $3.2 billion. And that's a clear indication now that Google actually see the customer end of the value chain as being an area that they're interested in. But what underpins this actually is the convergence of information, telecommunication, computing technologies with the traditional power system technologies. I do believe that the customer has the potential, supported by technology such as smart metering, to dramatically change the whole value chain of the electricity system. But there are risks associated with this in terms of deploying this technology and how the technology is deployed. It has to be seen as more than just the replacement of traditional meters and traditional power system technologies. It's about behaviour, it's about customer behaviour, it's about how the customer actually interacts with their supplier and with their electricity system. So smart metering is ultimately the enabler of a very, very different customer dynamic in terms of the electricity system. And then the role that markets will play then at the retail end of the business, the retail end of the energy value chain is about 10% of the total end user price. So what's the role that markets is going to play in a way that is cost effective and drives the behaviour change that is needed to get customers play a very, very significant role in bringing about the kind of changes to our energy system. And I suppose the fundamental question here is the market going to actually drive customer behaviour? And what that means then, and has deep implications for society, are we prepared to let price be the determinant of customer behaviour? So, for example, are we prepared to let the price of electricity go to very, very high levels at peak to incentivise customers to change behaviour and move maybe to cheaper times or lower their electricity consumption? This has huge societal implications. It has huge implications for policymakers, but that's at the pure end of the market. However, what is likely to happen is that we will take a societal view of this, and there will be interventions in the market then to lower those kind of the impacts, the negative impacts on customers, particularly in terms of fuel vulnerability and fuel poverty. But then, of course, what does that mean then for market design? So again, the market, back to that core question, where does the market sit and where does market design sit alongside government policies, alongside government incentives for things to be done by customers and by developers that are out of market? And how does the market actually change the way in which the power system is actually configured and actually works is a key policy issue. So I think what's very, very striking about the environment that we find ourselves in today in terms of energy policy is the scale of uncertainties, like nothing I've seen in the last 30 years. And it is, as the chairman said at the opening, characterised by the need to balance three conflicting objectives: affordability, the need for secure supply, and the need to arrest climate change. This is the trilemma, as I said earlier. But we cannot have a policy environment where at different times we're focusing on different elements. So we cannot focus on different elements of that trilemma at different points in time in the cycle, whether it's a policy or a political cycle or an economic cycle. And what's really required is stable long-term policy, regulatory and a market environment. And as you're aware, the Minister has launched a Green Paper, I said this earlier. It's an important document given the issues facing not only European but also Irish energy policy right now and the critical role that energy plays in a modern economy. It's a great opportunity for all of us, all stakeholders in this industry, to engage constructively in setting out a truly long-term vision and, more importantly, a roadmap on how we're going to transition to a clean, secure and affordable energy future. Thank you.